But let me sort of throw a curveball at you then. What about recognizing the positive and the negative of a fellow with nice facial hair called Karl Marx?
Sure.
So,
I mean, I have a section in the War in the West, as you know, where I go for Karl Marx with some glee.
so he seems to have gotten, some popularity in the West recently.
Not just recently, yeah. I mean, he's had a resurgence recently.
Yes, resurgence recently.
Well, that's because whenever things are seen to go wrong, people reach for other options. And when, for instance, it's very hard for people to accumulate capital, it's not obvious that they're going to become capitalists. And so one thing that happens is people say, let's look at the Marxism thing again, see if that's a viable goer. And my argument would simply be, point me to one place that's worked.
Well, the argument from the Marxist or the Marxian economists is that we've only really tried it once. The Soviets tried it, and then if there's a few people that kind of tried the Soviet thing.
Cuba tried it?
Well, they basically, it's an offshoot of this.
Sure.
Of
They tried
Soviet.
it.
Yes, they've tried
They
it.
tried it in Venezuela.
Yes.
So, but let's just quickly say, how did all these experiments go?
They did not. Well, they failed in fascinating ways.
They did, but they failed.
Yes, they failed.
And we should stress, so grossly failed. So grossly failed that they threw millions and millions of people into completely thwarted lives that were much shorter than they should have been.
Yeah, so the lesson to learn there, that you can learn several lessons. One is that anything that smells like Marxism is going to lead to a lot of problems. Now, another lesson could be, well, what is the fundamental idea that Marx had? He was criticizing capitalism and the flaws of capitalism. So is it possible to do better than capitalism? And that's, if you take that spirit, you start to wonder, that might actually become relevant in, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years when the machines start doing more and more of the labor, all those kinds of things. You start to ask questions.
We finally might get to Marx's dream of what the average day would look like.
Yes.
Well, there's going to be an awful lot of literary criticism then. If you remember, that's what Marx said that we would be doing in the evenings. The laborer in the evening.
Well, he didn't know Twitter was a thing or Netflix, so he would change.
Are there things we could learn from Marx? Plausibly, possibly. I can't think of anything myself offhand. But to have a critique of capitalism isn't by any means a bad thing in the society. I'd rather that it was a critique of capitalism that showed how you improve capitalism, a critique of the free market that showed how people could get better access to the free market, how you could ensure, for instance, that young people get onto the property ladder, things like that. Those are constructive things. The people who say we must have Marxism, I mean, don't know what the hell they're talking about, because that never leads to any of those things.
Haven't led in the past.
It's never led in the past, and at some point you've got to try to work out how many attempts you make at this damn philosophy before you realize that every attempt always leads to the same thing. I mean, we could pretend that fascism has never been properly tried, and that it was unfortunate what happened in Nazi Germany, but that wasn't real fascism, and in Mussolini's fascism, didn't go all that well, but it was, a bit better. And maybe we could try a bit more Franco-fascism. Nobody would have any time for this crap, nor should they. The people who try that are reviled, and quite rightly. So why do we tolerate it with the Marxism thing? And it's a great mystery to me, the way that people do tolerate it. Always in this stupid way of saying, we haven't done it yet. And if you keep trying the same recipe and every time it comes out as shit, it's that the recipe's shit.
Well, sort of, I'm trying to practice here by playing devil's advocate, practice the same idea that you mentioned, which is when you say the word Marxism, should you throw out everything or should you ask a question, is there good ideas here? And the same, it's the good, it's weighing the good and the bad and being able to do so calmly and thoughtfully.
Sure. Do you know the famous George Orwell comment on Stalin in an argument with a Stalinist? Do you know this?
No.
That's one of my favorite quotes. George Orwell in the early 40s gets into an argument with a Stalinist who's obviously a Marxist. And this is after the show trial is 37. This is when it's very clear what Marxism in the Russian form is. And this Orwell is in the discussion with this Marxist, and it goes on, and eventually Orwell says, well, what about the show trials, and he does, and what about what's happened in Ukraine, and the famines, and much more, and the purges, and the purges, and the purges, and eventually the Stalinist says to Orwell what Orwell knows he's going to say all along, which is, he says, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And Orwell says, where's the omelette?
Oh, yeah.
So
that's a really good, because
look at this by this stage, okay? How many...
Where's my damn omelet?
How many just messy, big, bloody, eggy piles have the Marxists created by now in country after country?
Yeah.
Always next time they're going to produce the great omelette. But they never have, and they never will, because the whole thing is rotten from the start. But let me just also say one thing about that, because of course Marx isn't as nice as he sounds. And that's one of the things that I try to highlight in the book is, if we're going to do this reductive thing of people in history and saying, well, they had views that were of their time, and we must therefore condemn them for them. Say, fine, let's do the same thing with Marx. And there are things I quote in this book from Marx's letters, not least the letters to Engels. And indeed, in his published writings, in pieces he was writing for the American press in the 1850s, where he has horrible views on slavery and colonialism and much more. But the main thing is, the horrible things he says about black people and the constant use of the N-word. In fact, when I was doing the audiobook for The War in the West, I had to decide, will I read out the quotes from Marx or not? If I had read them out, I'd have been cancelled, because people would have just said, you've been using the N-word so much in this passage, and this is, and I slightly thought of doing it so that I could say I was only quoting Marx to try to hit the point home. In the end, of course, I was sensible and decided not to. But Marx's letters are disgusting on these terms. Since I highlighted this in this book, and some of the media picked it up, and have popularized this thing I'm trying to put into the system, which is, if you're going to accuse Churchill of racism, if you're going to accuse Jefferson of racism, Washington of racism, and so on, what about Marx? The two things that Marxists have said since this came out has been, first of all, why are you saying this about Marx? He was a man of his time, like everyone else. And the second thing they say is, we don't go to Marx for his horrible, abhorrent views on race. So talking about mixed race people as gorillas and so on. We don't go to him for that. We go to him for his economic theories. I say, okay, well, we don't go to Thomas Jefferson for his views on slaves. We don't go to Churchill for the precise language he used that points in the 1910s about Indians.
Or his health advice.
Actually, I do get him for that. But
that explains so much.
But let's have some standards on this, and that's why I'm very suspicious of the fact that the people don't do this with Marx, because I think what some people are trying to do, and this may sound conspiratorial, but I really don't think it is. I think that some people are deliberately trying to completely clear the cultural landscape of our past in order to say there's nothing good, nothing you can hold on to, no one you should revere. You've got no heroes. The whole thing comes down. Who's left standing? Oh, we've also got this idea from the 20th century still about Marxism, or the 19th and 20th centuries. And no, I will not have the entire landscape deracinated and then the worst ideas tried again.
So basically destroy all of history and the lessons learned from history, and then start from scratch, and then it's completely, any idea can work, and then you could just take whatever.
Well, and the thing is, there are always some people with pre-prepared ideas. And I mentioned this also with the post-colonialists. The post-colonialists were really interesting, because when the European powers were moving from Africa and the Far East, post-colonial movements had one obvious move they could have done, which was to say, since the European powers have left, we will return to a pre-colonial life, which in some of their places would have mean returning to slave markets and slave ownership and slave selling and much more. But put that aside for a second. They could have said, we have an indigenous culture which we will return to. almost uniformly in the post-colonial era. You had figures like Frantz Fanon, you had European intellectuals like Sartre, who said the Western powers are retreating from these countries, and therefore we should institute in these countries what but Western Marxism.
Well, it's not obvious to me that like the bad ideas will be the ones that emerge, but it's more likely that the bad ideas would emerge in this kind of context when you erase history, when you erase tradition.
When you erase history and you leave some ideas deliberately uninterrogated.
Sure.
I mean, as I say, find me 1 in 100 American students who've heard of any of the communist despots of the 20th century. I mean, name recognition there was a poll done a few years ago in the UK, and like name recognition among children, school children, for Stalin, let alone Mao. I mean, Mao, who kills more people than anyone, 65 million Chinese, perhaps. How many students in America know what Mao was, who he was, where he was? Nothing.
Or the atrocities committed.
Where the atrocities were committed.
Or,
and I worry about that because it means that we might have learned one of the two lessons of the 20th century. We think we've learned one of the two lessons of the 20th century. We actually haven't learned that lesson. We've learned a little bit of it, and we've not learned the other one at all. Because that's why we still have people in American politics and elsewhere actually talking about collectivization and things, as if there's no problem with that, and as if it's perfectly obvious, and they could run it, and they'd know exactly where to stop.
What are the two lessons of the 20th century?
Fascism and communism.
Oh. Yeah. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what exactly the lessons are.
No, it's not clear. If the lessons were very clear, we'd be better at it.
Well, one is your book, broadly applied, of the madness of crowds. That's one lesson.
Well, how so?
Meaning like large crowds can display herd-like behavior.
Yes. Be very suspicious of crowds.
Yeah. In general, I mean, you apply it in more to modern application, in a sense, but that's rooted in history, that crowds can, when humans get together, they can do some quite radically silly things.
Elias Canetti is very good on that, crowds and power. And Eric Hoffer, who is a sort of self-taught, amazing, not to say autodidactic writer, The True Believer and so on, he was extremely good on that. But the reason I mentioned the two things, we should have realized that the two nightmares of the 20th century, fascism and communism, that we should know how they came about. And we're interested in learning how one of them came about, fascism. And we know some of the lessons, like don't treat other people as less than you because of their race. That's one lesson. But and we've done some good at learning that. But the second one, not to do communism again, not to do socialism, I think we're way away from knowing, because we don't know how it happened, and the little temptations are still there always. Look at people saying, "I'm going to expropriate your property." If people do things they don't like, say, we can't wait to take your property.
Well, there's an appealing sense. Okay, every ideology has an appealing narrative behind it that sells the ideology. So for socialism, for communism, is that it seems unfair that the working class does all of this work and gets only a fraction of the output. It just seems unfair. So you want to make
if they do get a fraction of the output, yes.
Yes. And so it seems to be more fair if we increase that. If the workers own all of the value of their output, and things that are more fair seems to be a good thing.
I'd say, well, yeah. I mean, fairness is. I like fairness as a
justice.
term. No, I much prefer fairness because it's a much easier thing to try to work out. It's quite amorphous itself as a concept, but everyone can recognize it. So, for instance, should the boss of the company earn 1 million times that of the lowest paid employee? It doesn't seem fair. Should they earn maybe 5 or 10 times the salary of the lowest employee. Yeah, possibly. That could be fair. There are certain sort of multiples which are within the bounds of, reasonableness. I think actually that's the much bigger problem in capitalism at the moment, as I see it, is the not untrue perception that a tiny number of people accrue a lot of the benefits, and that the bit in the middle has become increasingly squeezed and is at danger always of falling all the way down to the bottom. I mean, I think in the snakes and ladders of American capitalism, for instance, it's a correct perception to say that the snakes go down awfully far. If you tread on the snake, you can plummet an awfully long way in America. Yeah. And the deal in the game was that the ladders took you high. And there's a perception, and again, it's not entirely wrong, that the ladders system on the board is kind of broken.
So what you're saying is you're a Marxist.
I'm not saying I'm a Marxist.
You heard that here first in the in the out of context blog post you're going to write about this.
I get back to this point. The way to critique capitalism, if it's gone bad, is to get better capitalism.
Yes.
Free markets where they're not fair should be made fair. Never decide that the answer is the thing that has never produced any human flourishing, i.e. Marxism.